Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Hello and thanks for being here this evening. I'm Michael Hill. Tonight we're going to be talking about taking a look back at a moment in New York City, Black history that has not always been included in the narrative of Lower Manhattan where we are right now. And also at what it tells us about the larger movement of voting rights and an American multiracial democracy. We are joined tonight by a great panel of guests. Let's meet them now. Leslie M. Harris is a professor of history and African American studies at Northwestern University. She wrote In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 1863, and she's been a lead advisor to the Tenement Museum for the Union of Hope exhibit that you'll hear about in just a few minutes. Jelani Cobb is the Dean of the School of Journalism at Columbia University. You might know his writing from The New Yorker and from his documentaries on PBS. We'll hear from Jelani about some of the history of the Black press in America and the connection to voting rights then to today. Annie Polland is the president of the Tenement Museum and the author of Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration with Daniel Sawyer. How about a hand for our guest this evening? And from the start, we will hear from Anna Deavere Smith. You might know her, yes, you might know her from television, from The West Wing, Nurse Jackie, but she also basically created a new art form, what some call documentary theater, and a wide range of work like Fires in the Mirror, Twilight, Los Angeles. Here now to start us off is Anna Deavere Smith.
Moore, Joseph. Baker. House, 352 West 39th Street. Moore, Joseph, bootmaker. House, 143 Varick Street. Moore, Joseph, carman. House, rear 60 Henry Street. Moore, Joseph, carpenter. House, 428 West 32nd Street. Moore, Joseph, clerk. House, 224 East 86th Street. Moore, Joseph, laborer. House, 631 11th Avenue. Moore, Joseph, shoes, 143 Varick Street. Moore, Joseph, colored, waiter. House, rear, 17 Lawrence Street. Moore, Joseph P., waiter. House, 97 Orchard Street.
Thank you for that, Anna. Now, Annie, would you tell us what exactly did we just hear? What is that?
Yeah, it strikes me. I wasn't thinking about this before, but it strikes me now that isn't one of the challenge for an actor is that they can read the phone book and make it sound exciting. That's not why we're here. We know Anna Deavere Smith is an amazing actor, but at the Tenement Museum, we view documents like the phone book. This is not the phone book, but it's a city directory, which is the 19th century version of a phone book, basically identifying who lives in Manhattan, what jobs they do, and where they live. Essentially, these were created, for people to be able to kind of get in touch with one another and use it for commercial reasons in the 19th century. But we use it at the Tenement Museum. Documents like this and the census are like our Bible because we believe that ordinary people are fascinating and that they're excellent windows onto history. So we had been, for 2008, we opened an exhibit about an Irish immigrant named Joseph Moore. Joseph P. Moore and his wife Bridget, and we were telling their story. And as we often do on our exhibits, we pass out primary sources so that people can see. First of all, they know we're not making these stories up. And we were simply doing it on this tour to say, like, look, he lived at 97 Orchard, where we are right now, where the Tenement Museum is. But people were smarter than we were, and they were looking at it, and they were asking all sorts of questions about the Joseph that was above Joseph P. Moore. They were looking at Joseph Moore. They wondered, what does COL apostrophe D
That's
mean?
what I wondered.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so our educators would explain, COL apostrophe D was a abbreviation for colored, the term used in the 19th century for people of African descent. And then people wondered about Lawrence Street. Where's Lawrence Street? You're all New Yorkers. Do you know where Lawrence Street is? But you do know where West Broadway is, right? So West Broadway was once named Lawrence Street. So we started to research, and we found so much about this Joseph Moore, who was a waiter at 17 Lawrence Rear, and his wife Rachel. And we found so much information that we decided that we had to do an exhibit about them, and that's when we opened up our exhibit. Now, this was different for the Tenement Museum because up to that point we had only told the stories of people who live in our building, but they lived actually just, I think, 4 blocks from where we are today. You can see the 10th Ward. Ward is the name that was given to neighborhoods, really used up until the 1930s in New York. And you can see 103 Orchard Street, the Tenement Museum, and 97 Orchard Street in the 10th Ward. We're now in the 8th Ward, and you can see that Lawrence Street is just a few blocks away from WNYC, where we are today. So we started to research that area, and we wanted to see, is this tenement there? What can we learn about their tenement? We went to 17 Lawrence, now West Broadway, and instead of seeing tenements, we saw the Soho Grand Hotel, which we knew that, we couldn't do much with that. So we're historians, and so we look back into the past, and we were able to find a fire insurance map from the 1850s that shows where Joseph Moore lived. So you can see, again, Lawrence is today's West Broadway, 17, that pink square in the front with 17 Lawrence front, and we have a fascinating story there, but I won't go into detail because you have to come on the exhibit to hear. But then behind it, you can see there's like a white area that would have been the courtyard, and there's another light pink building behind it. That's 17 Lawrence Rear, where Joseph and Rachel lived. And so we had to use this and other sources, like the Black Press, like the manuscript census, the mainstream press, to kind of piece together their story. And we use that to create the exhibit that you can see here. You can see Joseph and Rachel's apartment that we've recreated at the Tenement Museum up there. Mm-hmm.
Could we put the directory back up? I want to point something out here. Mm-hmm. We're all familiar with the big, thick phone books that we used to get. Mm-hmm. This is 1870. Mm-hmm. In this short line or two here and there, look how descriptive this was in 1870 compared to the thick phone books that we used to get. Andy, that's amazing to me. We're talking about 1870 and all the descriptions right here, a lot of information. A lot of information, and I guess now we show this fuller one on the new tour, and people keep asking us more questions, so we have to create more exhibits about each one of these people. But one thing I want to point out, and this is what Leslie has written about so beautifully, so when you see Joseph Moore, where you see colored noted, bless you. You see colored noted. You don't see next to Irish people IRI. Right. You don't see next to German people GER or JEW for Jewish. Only Black people were demarcated as different or denoted as different, and this is 40 years after slavery has been abolished in New York State. So it's, I think, an important example of the shadow of slavery that Leslie writes about. As if you couldn't tell when looking at someone that they were Black compared to someone else because of. But they had to do this also here.
Designate so you would know who you were, who this person was, before you ever encountered them.
Right. And also before you hired them.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Leslie, you researched this time period and community extensively. What can you tell us about New York City's Black community in the 8th Ward, where we are right now, decades leading up to the Civil War and beyond? Who are these people?
So people like Joseph and Rachel Moore were many generations after slavery ends in New York. The first 2 centuries of New York, 1600s to 1827, is slave labor is how the vast majority of African Americans arrive in the city. As slavery ends, enslaved people began to settle in places like the 8th Ward. They try to move away from their former enslavers and establish schools and churches and have jobs. Unfortunately, most whites try to limit them to the lowest rung of the economic ladder. Joseph Moore is interesting. You had to pay to be in this directory. And being a waiter was actually a very good working class job for a black person at this time. It's steady work. Waiters were organized, black waiters were organized, and so he is actually a little better off than a lot of the black people who may have lived around him in the 8th Ward at that time. It was not a wealthy neighborhood by any means. The fact that he lived in a rear courtyard probably meant that either he couldn't afford more or he wasn't allowed to live in a better situation. But crowded in those spaces, people created community. They had a strong sense of themselves as political actors. And he actually and his wife and his mother, I think, came to New York City after the horrors of the draft riots, still seeking that opportunity that he thought the city could give him, moving from New Jersey to this place, hoping for a better life.
And you said even waiter at that time was considered a fairly good job at that time?
Yep, and before the Civil War, the black waiters actually made more money than some of the Irish waiters, and when they went on strike, they had to encourage the Irish waiters to go on strike for higher wages. So there's this moment when, blacks and Irish people are collaborating together within that profession, and second, it was a good job. The other kinds of jobs that black people had, tubmen, the people who would empty the privies, the toilets at night. Day laborer, going to the docks, hauling goods. This was a constant problem after slavery. During slavery, black people did every job and more. They were skilled workers. They did everything. When slavery ends, as one enslaver said, the law's freedom, let the laws take care of him. And so white skilled people didn't want to share space with them, and black and white employers followed that practice as well and would not hire black laborers. So they really had to get what they could.
And Joseph Moore had been in Belvedere, New Jersey, where he was born free, and he was working as an apprentice to a butcher. But he couldn't get that job in New York City. So even though being a waiter was better than a lot of other jobs, it wasn't as good as what he had done in New Jersey.
Which he could have eventually been an independent shop owner if he had been able to continue in that profession.
Jelani, I want to ask you something, but I want to continue this on Joseph Moore. He paid to be in that directory. Did he have a say, or would he have had a say in terms of don't list me as colored?
I don't think so, no. Yeah.
No. Jelani, I have to ask you, what was the political mood at that time? What was it like? And how do we know that?
Well, most of what we would know would be exactly from the black press. And so the black press starts, the first black newspaper is published in 1827. It's called Freedom's Journal. Its two primary publishers were Samuel Cornish and John B. Russworm. There is a little local connection here, though, which is that that paper was created in March of 1827 and distributed each Friday. And if you were eager to get your hands on a copy, the primary distribution point was number 5 Varick Street.
Wow.
So you could just stroll over a short distance from where we are this evening and get your fresh copy of the newspaper. By the time of the Civil War, there are as many as 40 black newspapers in the country, and they are concerned overwhelmingly with the status and conditions of those who are still enslaved, the possibility of coming, war, the possibility that that war will deliver emancipation. And they really provide the kind of color and flavor. Most of what we know about the kind of cultural and social conditions in these communities come from these newspapers.
Who were reading them? Who was writing for them?
So there are African-American, there's a significant degree of African-American literacy. People are reading, people are learning to read. If they're not learning in schools, they're learning in churches. This is a very important, thing to demarcate the ability to, the definition of slavery is the enforced illiteracy, and people pursue literacy as a means of marking their own freedom. We understood literacy in a different way then, as a kind of communal right. People would read the newspaper at home, read the newspaper out loud. And so you have a kind of burgeoning cadre of young black journalists who emerge at this time too. And they're writing about the politics of the day. They're writing about the community affairs. They're writing about social events. And you find an amazing degree of texture in these publications.
Were they endorsing candidates and so forth, endorsing political positions and things like that?
Certainly, certainly. And the thing is, I think that because the stakes are so high, that you find people, taking really overt kind of like we think we take our politics seriously now. I remember coming across, yeah, well, maybe not seriously enough, but but I remember coming across a black newspaper, and this is after the war, when the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, was thought to be the best way forward, but there were still Democrats in the South, and there was an editorial urging women not to marry any man who voted Democrat. And it was believed that any such man was in favor of slavery. At that point, the Democratic Party was, firmly aligned with the former plantation owners and slaveholders. And so any man who votes Democrat, you should not marry at all.
Annie? Oh, excuse me.
Oh, I just wanted to add with the black press, the part of the press that was like so important to us was actually the classifieds, right? So there you're hearing the voices of ordinary people who are looking for jobs, or they're advertising the ice cream parlor that they've just opened up, and you see women owning businesses. A woman, Madame Johnson, who teaches Spanish guitar and vocal lessons, or another woman who opens the ice cream saloon. And you're also seeing advertisements for benefits when Harper's Ferry happened and John Brown died. The women in the church organized a concert and had played hide-in and sold tickets and had 1,000 people come to hear this, and then sent the money to the widow of the martyr. So that there, you see religion, education, fundraising, all coming together. And the woman who organized it was also the principal of the colored school, because schools at the time, public schools, were segregated. So you get a lot of the texture also just from looking at the kind of the classified section.
Jelani, I have to ask you, when you start talking about the political mood, how did the 15th Amendment, how did that come about, and what led to it?
So there are a few things. One is that when we think about first, it's difficult for us to recall the scale of the destruction of the Civil War. It is astonishing. And to give some sense of it, 720,000 people die in the course of this war. To give a sense of what that means, we would have to fight Vietnam about 14 times to get that number of casualties. Or we talked about 20th century comparatively modern warfare, we would have to fight World War II almost twice to get that number of American casualties. And so a tremendously bloody war. The primary objective of the Republican Party, which holds sway, most Democrats are no longer in Congress. The South has been eliminated from political contention through the Reconstruction Acts and so on. The primary concern is to prevent the South from regaining the kind of political power it had. It nearly had enough power to tear the country in half for reasons relating to the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Electoral College and a bunch of other things in the Constitution. And so everything that you see in Republican politics has this in mind. It becomes clear after the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery for the most part, after the 14th Amendment, which establishes citizenship and equal protection under the law, there becomes a concern in Congress, especially among radical Republicans in Congress, that everything that they're doing can be washed away with the changing of political tides. And so how do you prevent this from happening? Well, if you give the ballot to the emancipated population, you can create a group of voters who you're almost certain are not going to vote for the Democratic Party, which is solidly in the corner of the former slaveholders. This takes a lot of effort, even within the Republican Party. There is great division. And there are Republicans from free states who lose office, in the midterms prior to the passage and ratification of the 15th Amendment, because they are advocates for suffrage for Negroes, as they would have then been called. A tremendously divisive issue. But ultimately, it carries the day because there is the belief that but for putting the ballot in the hands of the former slaves, you have no safeguard that the cause that 700,000 people died to settle, that none of this will be permanent and all of it can be reversed.
Wow. And Annie, how did people respond to this? How did people react to the ratification of the 15th Amendment?
In New York, they celebrated. So on the streets that we have here, just the streets around us, we found that people hung banners and they celebrated and they marched through the whole city, having a big speeches at Union Square and then at Cooper Union. It was probably upwards of 15,000 people took part in this parade. So it was a huge celebration. And keep in mind that up to this point, right, still after the Civil War, black people in New York could not vote for the most part. In the 1820s, there had been in 1821 a law passed, even as it was granting white men suffrage, regardless of property. Black men had to have $250 worth of taxable property, which essentially made it impossible to vote in New York if you were black. There were a handful of people that could vote. So there was a huge celebration marking finally in 1870 when the 15th Amendment was passed in April. I think it was April 8th. People came together on these very streets, the streets where Joseph and Rachel lived.
And were people able to take advantage? I know that given those stipulations, were black men able to vote? Any of them actually went and voted?
Yes, and what was important too, beyond just a celebration that I think we'll hear about in just a minute, there was the enforcement acts. So that it wasn't just that the amendment was passed. Congress knew that there had to be enforcement acts that would send federal troops to guard voting and to make sure that black people indeed were able to vote. But the celebration, it's just amazing to kind of hear about all these people coming together, having waited for so long.
Wow. Right now we're going to hear from Anna Deavere Smith again, reading a newspaper description of this parade and the events.
The 15th Amendment, great day among the colored citizens, a grand procession. That district, lying north of Canal Street and west of Broadway, where colored people form a large colony by themselves, presented an animated appearance during the morning. Nearly every house, no matter how poor the tenants, bore some emblem of rejoicing. American flags were suspended at intervals across Thompson, Sullivan, Lawrence, and Worcester streets. Several were decorated with mottos. Among others were the following: "Out of Egypt have I brought my children." One prominent place was, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. Impartial suffrage to all, without distinction of race or color. By the bullet, we gained the ballot." Extracts from President Lincoln's second inaugural were freely displayed. Streamers and ribbons of varied hue floated in every direction. The colored people themselves seemed impressed with the importance of the occasion. The streets were thronged with men, women, and children, dressed in their holiday attire. All ages and classes were represented. Tottering age and smiling infancy walked side by side. those who had been slaves and those who had never experienced the bitterness of bondage, united to express their joy that the day of Jubilee had indeed dawned. A fact that created no little surprise was the large and respectable turnout of carriages. Upward of 200 barouches and other vehicles were in the line of procession. The horses were adorned with miniature flags and ribbons. A number of cars, drawn by 8, 10, and 12 horses respectively, was a noticeable feature. In one was the orator of the day, Reverend William H. Garnett. This was drawn by Herring's stud horses. Another car contained nearly 100 little girls, pupils of the public schools, who sang songs at different points along the march. Still another had a number of old men and women, upwards of 80 years of age, who had been formerly held in slavery and who had been invited from all parts of the country. Several colored veterans of the late war were objects of interest and respect. Delegations were present from Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Jersey City, and other places. The escort, furnished by the police commissioners, headed the line. The procession was composed of the various colored societies, civic and military. The committee had invited all who were willing to participate to take part, and the ranks, accordingly, were very full.
Jelani, Annie, listening to that, what stands out to you?
So bear in mind what this community has seen. They have seen the draft riots, in the course of the war. They have seen the bloody conclusion of this terrible crucible. They've seen the assassination of the president. They have seen very many people who have family members who have participated in this war. And then in a short period of time, we're going all the way back to 1619, where bondage has been the order of the day. You see slavery abolished in 1865. You see citizenship conferred in 1868. And now, astoundingly, unbelievably, you see suffrage granted. That is, and I don't think we have the language to articulate how stunning a difference that is in the lives of people who are here. And those people, I think, if we think about how we understand these things now, they're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the little girls who they mention in that carriage, and they're thinking about their children and their children after them. And metaphorically, they use the biblical language, out of Egypt, out of bondage. And so they understand the world in these very kind of theological ways, that there's this metaphor for them approaching a kind of freedom.
Annie?
Yeah, I just think, too, about Henry Highland Garnett. When he speaks, he addresses people at Union Square. This is from another account of the day. And when he's at Union Square, he looks at everyone. He says, 6 years ago at Union Square, we saw destruction. We saw people kill our children. There are probably men here, or boys here, whose fathers hung from poles. And here we are now, and I can address you as fellow citizens. And he said, let me say again, fellow citizens. And I think just there was something reading that and just trying to imagine Joseph and Rachel Moore in that procession, seeing those banners. Maybe they hung out the banner, out of Egypt have I brought my children. Again, that joy, especially when you think like so many men that would be either in that parade or watching that parade men like Joseph Moore, who had worked as a waiter, and he would have, his fellow waiters who were Irish or German, after 5 years, they could go to vote. But he, who's born free in New Jersey, and he's doing the same work as they are, unable to vote. And so finally, right, to have that, I can't imagine it. It gives me a lot of joy today. And just thinking about how this community kept hope, and they kept aspiration, and they worked to do that. I think about this all the time. I can't imagine how much work they had to put into maintaining hope, and I think it's a inspiration for all New Yorkers, all Americans today.
And they just never gave up.
No, I mean, they really didn't. And these are people who were living in tenements. So if you're living in tenements, whether you're Black, you're Irish, you're losing your children. Your children are dying from cholera or all sorts of diseases. Both Joseph and Rachel had been married to other people before they found each other, but both their respective spouses had died from diseases that, flourished in the tenement district. So these are people that have to just, be constantly remaking their households. Even their daily lives were, took such strength, physical strength and moral strength.
Leslie, I have to ask you, how did they keep going?
Events like this. What struck me with this parade is how massive it is. When slavery ends in 1827, New Yorkers, it ends on July 4th, but Black New Yorkers cannot celebrate on that day because they will be attacked in the streets. So they celebrate on July 5th, and people hide in churches rather than being out in the open. But they are constantly pushing back against those barriers, against those limits, and fighting. So this parade is the exact opposite of what has been true of the history of New York up until this time. The other thing is that they are in collaboration with the radical abolitionists. They are fighting for the vote. There had been a referendum in the state that people voted on in 1860 to give them the vote, and it failed. And so, it's hard to state how horrific the New York City draft riots in the middle of the war were. The New York City population actually dropped. People left New York, Black people pledging never to return. So the triumph of this moment is quite incredible. I still think about Joseph and Rachel Moore, who must have known about this riot and yet still choose to come and
they're
come to New York.
actually here. They stay in New York.
Exactly.
They stay in New York, and they have an Irish roommate.
And they're exceptional in that. Not in having an Irish roommate, but that is not exceptional. So there's the line that this is where all the Black people are and only Black people are. It's like, well, I don't think so.
Right, yeah.
That's not how it works. But that they've committed. And they have been fighting, some people for decades. They mentioned that there are 80-year-old men who are in the parade who are from the South. I'm sure there are 80-year-old New Yorkers who are there too, who remember what it was like before. And in these very streets can't believe almost that this is happening, that they are finally, the 13th Amendment certainly, but the 14th Amendment, citizenship, and then this moment of the possibility of voting.
One of the accounts of the day also said that basically, there were all the Black people in New York were so excited to go to this parade that that the rest of New York was suffering in the sense that people at the barber, had their chins got scraped because the barber was going too fast, right, and right. The cook left early. Yes. But so that was the way that this one newspaper was kind of describing the whole scene.
Well, it also that makes me think about who wasn't celebrating this moment. I mean, again, it was not that long ago that people said, no, we do not want, and the history of New York is one in which Blacks didn't vote. When Black people were cut out of universal white manhood suffrage, in New York City there were exactly 16 people who could vote, 16 Black men who could vote after 1821.
And yet, every few years, they organize delegations to go to Albany and try to get that overridden.
Consistently. They never stopped asking for the vote.
And that had happened, I think, in late 1869, right? So just before the 15th Amendment had passed, New York State had said, no, we're not going to do this on our own.
Yeah.
So you needed the federal government to do this.
Exactly.
There was a Reverend Butler from the AME Zion Church who spoke at this parade, And Anna Deavere Smith is going to join us once again to read an excerpt from Reverend Butler's speech. We like the dramatic pause.
I got caught up in the conversation. That it wasn't my fault. I didn't do my Sound of Music joke, though, so. No, I didn't.
It's time to sit down and review the situation to inquire what the amendment has done for us and where it has left us. Many suppose past distinctions are wiped out. To this end, the colored people must now make demands. They begged before, they demand now. They want all the trades open to their children. They also demand a fair day's work for a fair day's wages. They want liberty and work. Work in the forge, the factory, the printing office, the counting house, the custom house. In every department of government. They demand this without distinction of race or color. They ask it now and for all time to come. They ask it as American citizens, Native Americans, as tillers of the soil for the past 300 years. Let them strike out colored from their Christian associations and African from their churches. No longer colored, no longer black, but American citizens. To be a colored man on the continent, be regarded as the noblest handiwork of God.
Jelani, I'm curious, what did you hear there as the main message of the Reverend Butler speech?
So what's interesting is that, we're talking about the politics of the 1860s, but that is a speech that you might have heard in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, 100 years later. The other part of it is a paradox that is immediately apparent, which is there's one thing to have freedom in theory, and it is a very different thing to have freedom in practice. And so talking about the specific particular ways, especially around labor, and that people should not have any distinction and that they should have a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, that all of these things are really fundamental, that if you have the right to vote, that's wonderful. But it has to be able to actually get you something. It has to be able to get you closer to this ideal of equality. And immediately, before the ink is dry on this one right, they're saying we have to be able to put this to work to get closer to the other thing. The last thing I'll say is that there's an interesting distinction. He recognizes, and very often, as we saw on the registry, that colored is kind of listed as kind of a pejorative, meant to distinguish people. But there are sometimes black institutions that specifically list themselves in that way, partly so that other black people will know what they are. And so the AME Church, is the African Methodist Episcopal, and specifically listing themselves as that to designate them, to differentiate themselves from the Methodists who had physically ejected them from their churches, not allowing them to pray in proximity to white Christians. And so the idea that there is this moment where people will wash away those distinctions and simply be thought of as American, which is probably a little bit different than how we would see it now, because we don't necessarily see distinctions between people celebrating a particular community or particular heritage or tradition and seeing that as part of the larger fabric or mosaic of what makes the nation what it is.
Annie, how about you? What message did you get from that?
You know, it's interesting when we share that. I usually on a tour, I've been talking at that point for an hour, so I give it to one of the visitors. Usually I try to pick someone with a British accent because they, you know.
You want to try it now?
But they read the speech, right? And they, on the tour, what we've seen previously is from the Black newspaper, Reverend Levine Tillman and his wife Sarah had a employment agency. And that was where we imagined Joseph and Rachel would have looked to this to see when they moved to New York, what kind of jobs they could have. What kind of jobs could a Black person coming to New York have? And it's washerwoman, waiter, coachman, all various servants, cooks, things like that. That's it. Not butcher, not cabinet maker, not any of the other things that other people were able to, white people were able to get. So to think about that and to think about basically saying, okay, that's great, we can vote, but we want access to these jobs. We want fair wages. We want our children to work in the forge, the factory, the foundry, all of those things. And I think that, you know, that's that ability to kind of say that the work isn't done here, there's more work to do. That's what comes to my mind.
You know, while Black men gained the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, it would be decades before Black women or women in general were able to do the same. And even after the passage of the 15th Amendment, there remained levels of disenfranchisement for Black men, but there were other ways to organize within communities, of course. And Leslie, you've written about the importance of Black communal life, the range of societies and churches. What role do these communal sites continue to play today?
They have to continue to work through those sites. As both Jelani and Annie have said, the vote is only one piece of political activism. And these are people who have spent decades organizing politically because they were locked out of formal politics. They know how everything around formal politics informs what happens in Congress, in City Hall, on the streets. And so what he's saying is we can't rest. We have to continue to do that kind of work. The vote is only one, perhaps very important piece, but you know, from this point, Black New Yorkers, if you're talking just very locally, their percentage in the population will decrease to 1.5%. With the European migration, with Black people going to different places. So even on this very local level, they're not going to have enough votes to say this is a block vote that can influence. So they really have to continue to work through other ways. So I hear this minister calling for the continuation of that kind of activism. They have to go in the streets. They have to continue to collaborate with others. One more thing. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Don't go on.
Now we don't know what the other thing is.
Go on.
Well, one more thing is that the churches, the organizations, all of these places serve very multiple roles for these people. So when you go to church at this time, as this speech indicates, you're going to learn about political activism. The other thing I was thinking, though, too, was that I'm not sure how many Blacks would have agreed with the good Reverend about erasing African. I mean, the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, these are now pillars of the community. These are the places where they have gathered strength. And so I'm, sort of curious about his call to let go of those names, because is he saying that they should go back into the predominantly white Methodist Church, which in a few decades will link back with the Southern Methodist Church that excluded them. So I think that is the beginning, this speech is the beginning of another debate about how Black people should see themselves as citizens, but also as distinctive because their needs are distinctive and because others see them as distinctive too.
Henry Highland Garnett, who Andy just mentioned, spoke frequently of his African ancestry. With great pride, with tremendous pride, because he specifically wanted to reject the stigma that had been attached to the word African. And so he was thinking about this at the same time. So I don't know that, to Leslie's point, I don't know that everyone would have agreed with Reverend Butler about this being the direction everyone wanted to go.
Was it an attempt then to kind of just assimilate to a certain extent, or?
I mean, freedom, nobody has experienced freedom. You can kind of forgive people for not knowing exactly what it's supposed to look like.
Right.
Like, what does it look like? Can we fly? I don't know, maybe. Let's see.
Jelani, I have to ask you, beyond this parade and the celebration of the 15th Amendment, what was political life like for Black New Yorkers, and how does that compare to trends elsewhere throughout America?
I mean, come on, that's a Leslie question.
You want me to take it?
Yeah, I want you to take the question.
So they're watching, they're watching the South, certainly. And the South is really the heart of Black political life at this time. We still, in terms of the Reconstruction and immediate post-Reconstruction years, we have not elected the number of Black people from sheriffs all the way up to Congress to elected office that happened during that incredible time. It was also a time of incredible violence. And if the New York City draft riots were 5 horrific days, Southern states experienced this for weeks, months, if not years, the kind of white violence against Black people who are voted into office, who are exercising the right to vote. It is both a time of great hope and terrible, awful destruction. And so in some ways, what happens in New York is important, but the struggle for what freedom, citizenship with the 14th, and the vote will mean is really on those blood-soaked grounds in the South. And it's new blood. It's not just Civil War blood. So I don't think there are many people who are making the same arguments that Reverend Butler is making in the Southern states, for sure. There are some Southerners who are coming north who are trying to escape that violence, and they come to New York. And they are looked down upon by New Yorkers here as being too Southern, too rural, and all of that. But the real struggle around this is happening there. It is very much about formal politics as well as education. Can Black people have their own schools? Can they have their own institutions? Are they allowed to do anything except labor? It's a really weird, here people can't find work. There, everyone wants every Black person, including children, to work constantly. And so it's a very funny opposition, a paradox.
Can I add one thing, not to Leslie's perfect answer, but to something we talked about, you mentioned in passing, which is that the 15th Amendment is ratified, but it takes until the 19th Amendment for women to get the right to vote. There's a calculation that's made here, which is that, remember, the primary objective of Republican politics is to ensure that the South does not regain the kind of political authority it had in 1860. After the end of the Civil War, the white male population in the South is decimated. And so there's a fear that if you give the right to vote to women, you will empower the wives of these former Confederates, of these deceased Confederates, and they will become a political counterbalance. And in fact, because there are more white women than there are Black men, the South will essentially accelerate its path back to political empowerment. And so the calculation is made that you give the right to vote without any distinction of color to men, and therefore you create this voting bloc which will be reliably opposed to the former slaveholders.
Jelani and Leslie, let me ask you this. What reverberations does this discussion of the 15th Amendment, what does it have for today?
Freedom isn't free. I'm just kidding. I have to say I've been thinking about this a lot. The vote is not enough, clearly, and the party.
Is it the vote that's not enough, or the exercising of the vote?
Both. I was going to say the party system that you, Jelani, really put on the table here, which we haven't those two parties, they have flipped in terms of their ideologies, but the fact that we have those two parties with a much larger population now means that what we're voting for is much less, it has much less give in it. It doesn't really, I don't think it can really reflect all that we need. So the other forms of politics that we have, the other weapons, we have to continue to use newspapers, journalism, we have to continue to support journalism. But you know, the thing I would add, even at that time, black journalism, yes, there were journalists, but these people were also just people. And people, when they read those papers, they also wrote in and said, I don't agree with blah, 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 you know, no matter how good or bad their literacy was. So there's a kind of, a more particular kind of daily political activism that has to be that is part of this history and has to be part of what we do. And we can't just vote and walk away, which I will admit, I used to be that person too. I mean, but that there has to be more. If it's on the hyper-local level, which for many of these New Yorkers it was, through churches, through other community groups, or on a bigger national stage. When you hear that these enslaved people went to different cities to march in these parades, these formerly enslaved people, these 80 and 90-year-olds, that's real. People would leave the South repeatedly to celebrate different anniversaries of the end of slavery. And, but that is connected to saying that we are here, we are part of this nation, we are to be counted. And we have to figure out what those ways are now, and they're not in front of a computer screen on an iPhone. And I think we've forgotten that.
And Jelani, before you answer that, we're going to go to questions here in just a minute. Just give us a show of hands so we can have a microphone there for you so that we can record your question. Jelani, your response.
You know, I think a lot about how much effort it was required to loosen the grip of slavery on the land. You know, Frederick Douglass, you know, at the meeting, at abolitionist meeting, following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, you know, he spoke, people saying, okay, we've achieved what we wanted. We have this amendment that abolishes slavery, and so we should disband. And Douglass very wisely says, oh, do you think this is over? And then he uses a phrase that I think will endure, has endured. He said, let's see what new skin this old snake takes on. And so when we look at the battles that people were fighting then, it gives some context to the things that we're fighting for now. It's good to see what people were willing to sacrifice for the idea of freedom in their time. And that can serve as maybe a degree of inspiration for us to recognize what we have to sacrifice, what's worth sacrificing for in our time.
Questions? Brooke Gladstone right here.
Are you going to do that with everyone, Michael? You know, you said something, Leslie, that was, you know, I'm going to show my ignorance here, but after slavery was abolished, at least in New York, you said people couldn't go out on the 4th and celebrate because they risked dying. What was the city like in those years?
It was very hostile to the black presence. So the Freedom's Journal, in those scant 2 years that it existed, one of the first things that they wrote about in that newspaper were, even on a Sunday, taking an afternoon walk. If you were a black person, you had to give the sidewalk to white people. They would literally elbow you out of the way. They would look at you like, how are you dressed up so fancy? Who gave you the day off? So the idea that slavery was ending, which had been, you know, fought out in Albany, but, you know, it took almost 30 years. And New York and New Jersey were the last two northern states to end slavery, be clear. New Jersey ending their slavery with the 13th Amendment. So when July 4th was the white working men's holiday. So suddenly black people are going to celebrate on July 4th? It was really, and there were really fights about it. Some people did go out on July 4th. Others, particularly ministers, celebrated inside on July 5th, literally in their churches, because the fear was that it would turn into a riot. Now, there were many riots, race riots, through the 19th century, so this was only the beginning of race riots with free black people. But freedom became a situation where black life was not valued in the same way, because you weren't taking that money, the worth of that life, from an enslaver who owned, right, who owned that
That's right.
person. So, and you see the same thing in the South with lynching afterwards. Suddenly it's easier to kill a black person because you don't have to answer to the white person who owns them.
And even in New York, in the streets of New York, up until the Civil War, if you were black walking the streets of New York, you could be apprehended by a slave catcher who could,
That's
right.
who could. So it's not just you can't celebrate. Sometimes you can't even just,
Go to work.
make sure that your kids going to school are going to be safe. And that also, even though that goes away with the end of the Civil War, the racism certainly doesn't. And so even at the end of the Civil War in March, when New York is organizing to celebrate these Union successes, they don't let black communities be part of the parade. They let Irish and Italian have the carts go by as part of the parade, but not black people. So the hatred and the racism is not erased.
But bearing in mind, just as a kind of footnote to this, 200,000 black men fought in the Civil War, and they're not allowed to participate in the parade.
I saw a hand back here, way in the back, right there. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. Were there any states that allowed black men to vote before the 15th Amendment?
Pennsylvania
Yeah.
did for a minute, and then they repealed it, is my
In
memory.
fact, they repealed it.
But most places actually didn't. and none of the
Pennsylvania was
places-
like,
maybe not.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Not on the basis of equality for the most part.
But one of the things that I love about Thaddeus Stevens is that he quit the Pennsylvania legislature because they passed this law prohibiting black suffrage, and specified in his will that he refused to be buried in a white cemetery, because his everything in his fiber, every fiber in his being was opposed to racial hierarchy.
Another hand? Way over here.
Hi. Wait, is it on? Yeah. Hi. Thanks so much. It's been really fascinating. It was kind of a random question, but I just finished a biography of President Grant, and I know his reputation was pretty negative for a long time, and this book that I read was actually very, very praising him, and I was just curious if you guys could opine on kind of that journey and how it's been reflected in the African American community, or kind of what people thought back then about him, or and what they think now.
Yeah, it just strikes me like Grant's tomb, I think, is one of the only markers that kind of is talking about the Reconstruction era in a way. So he was very popular when he comes back to New York after he serves as president. And also it was a black man, and I'm blanking on the name, but was in charge of the fundraising for Grant's tomb.
I don't have any specific, everyone is so obsessed with Lincoln, and I mean even our person, Joseph Moore has a picture of Lincoln,
Yes,
but not
right.
of Grant. I mean, I think Grant and the Republicans who are in office are certainly known among people like Frederick Douglass for welcoming black people into the federal bureaucracy, and the Republican Party as a whole is certainly so strongly supported. But in terms of Grant in particular, he doesn't have, the people that I look at don't really talk about him either way very much.
Yeah, he doesn't have the same.
He doesn't have the
cult of
same,
personality.
no.
And you can see on the mantle, just Leslie referenced that Joseph Moore had a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, and so you can see that in our reproduction of Joseph's home.
Much the same way people would have JFK, I guess.
Later,
Right.
yeah.
Later.
And not Lyndon Johnson, right? No one,
Exactly.
Lyndon Johnson
But he's
is a lot,
coming
but
from
nobody's
Great
got his
society.
picture on it.
Right. Right. We have another question back here, please.
I was just curious to ask if you could make some parallels between the then and now. From a political and economic point of view, New York was certainly not a big, New York City certainly was not an anti-slavery haven. There were considerable economic interests that tied what was going on here to the south with cotton and such. I'd like to know if you could sort of flesh that out and perhaps give some background as to how that might have pushed the passage of the 15th one way or the other.
I mean, New York, again, New York itself is so tied to the South. And much of the, it is really a battleground between pro and anti-slavery forces all the way through. I mean, the draft riots themselves are sort of this low point, the lowest, most violent point of the rejection of racial equality and a link to the South, to really, that people are in support of it. And I don't, even with the end of the war, again, this discussion we were having about the parade and the passage of the 15th Amendment, it is not that much better at that point. I think it's still a democratic, stronghold. All the, in terms of the machine politics and all that, it is not a Republican stronghold in that case. So I think the thing economically that makes New York, it does make New York appealing for black people, and more so as we move into the 20th century, things like the post-World War I, the Harlem Renaissance and all of those things. There is the growth of this incredible culture in the early 20th century, and that's usually what we focus on when we think about Black New York. But the period, this earlier period, it really takes a long time to get to that point.
And politicians were eager to seize on people's economic anxieties to breed. So, you have Democratic politicians that are saying to German workers, for example, like, are you really going to support the cause of the Negro? That's going to take bread out of the mouths of your children, right? Your American dream of economic opportunity is going to get in the way with this ideal of freedom. And so there are politicians, Democratic politicians, who are actively playing off of those economic concerns that immigrant populations had at the time and working class populations did.
Just as a quick footnote, we sometimes forget, we know that Reconstruction ended with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. We sometimes forget that Samuel Tilden was a New York politician, that the mechanism that the South used to end Reconstruction was his candidacy. At the same time, there were areas of New York City, certainly New York State, that were populated by abolitionists. It was a kind of abolitionist kind of thing. What makes New York complicated is we can't conflate, and so economically speaking, New York has a very significant sugar refining industry, which is almost completely forgotten, and also textile, the kind of garment and kind of refinement, where's that cotton coming from, and also finance. So even the kind of origins of New York City's, kind of banking economy is tied to loans being made, to Southern plantations and slaveholders. What makes it complicated, and Leslie can back me up on this, is that there's a distinction between anti-slavery and abolition. There are people who are opposed to slavery or opposed to the expansion of slavery for economic reasons. They don't have any particular sympathies for black people. They may be contemptuous of black people, but they think economically slavery winds up being a bad deal for free white men in terms of labor competition. And so there's that dynamic there as well. So it's kind of hard to necessarily map out things just in terms of being kind of pro-slavery or anti-slavery. People operate in a lot of different ways for different reasons.
And when you mean by abolition, you mean actually people who are working to end slavery.
People who are working to end the slavery, but people who also have a kind of moral sense that slavery is evil, slavery is wrong.
And who are also in favor of racial equality, even
Right.
as they struggle with it themselves. So the
Right.
radical abolitionists, for them, ending slavery and creating racial equality were two halves of the same whole.
Right.
And they're constantly struggling, more so with how to create racial equality. But a lot of people, by the time of the Civil War, are against slavery because they don't want slavery to expand into the West. They want to create
Right.
a white man's land. This is why California, Washington State, talk about places that don't allow voting. They don't allow black people to
Yes.
move there.
Which is amazing. Like the Illinois legislature passed a law, which I was a graduate student when I was reading, because this comparison wasn't pointed out. I just happened to be reading these two different documents. One was a document in which the state of Illinois, the legislature prohibited transporting any enslaved Negro into the state of Illinois. And they then passed a law that prohibited any free Negro from entering the state of Illinois. And I was like, I remember reading it and just bursting out into laughter, because I was like, if you can't come in as a slave and you can't come in as a free person, I'm starting to suspect that you don't want us here.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do we have another hand? Right here, the gentleman here.
I'm just curious, when did blacks started getting elected to office in New York? You talk about the numbers, and we disproportionate to the population. When did we start seeing elected officials?
That's a good question.
I think it's not till Adam Clayton Powell, because don't forget, as Leslie was saying, I think the black population as late as 1900 was, I think, 2% of New York. So you didn't have this, whereas the Irish could all gather around other Irish politicians and Germans and so forth. But I'm pretty sure it's not until the 1940s in New York.
No, it's
Yeah,
later.
he's after. He's elected in 1944, is it?
Yeah.
Somewhere around there?
In other states, there, and so
Chicago was
one of the
earlier.
right, Chicago, and even of course in the Reconstruction era, I forgot to mention this, but one of the people who spoke at the podium as part of that procession was Hiram Revel, who was the first African American senator from Mississippi, I believe.
Another question? Over here? Yes.
Hi, so I guess this is for the Tenement Museum. I'm a teacher in the DOE, and we're constantly doing genealogy.
Oh, we love you.
Oh, I love it. And my students always get mad in the morning. Like, come on, guys, let's go into Ancestry. Have you guys ever found any descendants of the Moors?
Oh, that's a great question. So a couple things. I have so many things to say to you. Number one, we traced, there's this amazing story that we found. Joseph Moore had a grandmother named Isabella Moore. And she lived to be 106 years old in New Jersey. So because of that, one of the ways, if you want a lot of newspaper articles written about you, live long. Because people are like, here's this woman who lived at the time of George Washington and lived through. So we what was it like for Joseph Moore to hear stories from Isabella Moore, his grandmother? And Joseph Moore between 1870 and 1880, he moves to New Jersey, to Jersey City. And his wife Rachel has passed away. He remarries and has a daughter named Isabella, named for, again, we speculate. So then we think, what were the stories Joseph told Isabella? So of course, we're looking for descendants, and the trail gets lost. But we do find that Joseph had an uncle, his mother's brother, Aaron Huff, who we know about because he was the first Black student at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and then would go on to form a Lutheran church in Easton, Pennsylvania that keeps his memory alive. So through him, we were able to find his great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, who has come to visit the exhibit. And we show students on the tour, we show a picture of her holding up the picture of Aaron Huff. And she writes, she didn't know about Joseph Moore because, again, how many of you know about your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's nephew? That didn't get passed on. But she writes really beautifully because, we write to her, is it okay to share your picture? Is it okay to do this? And she said, of course it is. I'm so proud that my ancestor stories are told because so many stories of African Americans are hidden behind the untrue stories of white people. And so it was just this kind of this moment of her thinking through. And we talk about that a lot on the tour and with students. And I think we even have an image. You can see students in the exhibit looking at these primary sources. And we're doing a new project called Flags, which is taking those banners, those mottos, out of Egypt have I brought my children, impartial suffrage to all, and asking students, to learn about this, but then to envision what are the causes. Democracy is hard. Democracy is a struggle. What are the causes you believe in? And in 25 years or so, when those causes come, what are the flags you're going to create? I love this because it's a reclamation of the American flag, right? And these ideas of these mottos and ordinary people writing their history onto it. I mean, those mottos are, the everyday people who are witnessing history, and they're speaking about it and leaving their mark. So one of the things that's really important for us to do with students of all backgrounds is say, go find out about your family history, because for many of us, our stories weren't in the archives. And so therefore, those stories are in your families. They're in the objects that have been passed down. They're in the recipes. They're in all of these things that are part of your daily life. And so that's a big, part of the mission of the Tenement Museum. So find me after this program, and we're signing you up and all your students to be part of these programs.
We have time for one more question here.
I wanted to ask, and I don't mean to bring this down, but maybe you'll be more optimistic than I am. With all the activities in many states with voter ID laws and with gerrymandering, what's your prognosis for the 15th Amendment's efficacy?
Prognosis for?
For the lasting effect of the 15th Amendment.
Well, the 15th Amendment, I actually, in preparation for this, I went to the government.org, usgov.org, to see the actual text.
Is it still there?
It's still there. And my copy that I'm going to hold on to has when you print it, it has a little imprint that says official government thing, so I'm keeping it.
When was that?
2 days ago.
Okay.
I'm keeping it 2 days ago. And it's a very simple thing that it calls for, which is just that no one can, on the basis of, race, et cetera, can prevent you from voting. It's very simple. We know that in the decades afterwards, people found all kinds of ways to subvert this very simple thing. And here we are again. So I re-upped with the ACLU.org because they got lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. If you were a lawyer, maybe you need to rethink some career choices about where you work, because we need you. I mean, it's a struggle. I mean, there's no other way to say it. That it's not just in the U.S. It's everywhere. So we have to. Those of us who think that there's a different way to be, we have to dig in. The people who are. I don't know how, is this being broadcast? Sorry, no. But the people who are in power now dug in for decades. And now it's our turn. That's all I can say.
And so we have to learn from the people of the Eighth Ward who created these networks, who created these societies, who brought people together, again, physically together, not just on Zoom.
No.
To be talking about
They had to come,
what
they had
was
to talk,
happening.
and they had to think about it together. I mean, it's actually not something that we can read the history. We can see that they did the gathering, but what they did may not serve what we need. And for us to figure out what we need, we have to gather. We have to do that work. So
Stuart and Karen, are you going to host something at your house?
So, I don't know. But there's a lot that keeps us busy in this particular culture. But, Joseph and Rachel Moore, they were working who knows how many hours a week. And
Well, they worked 6 days a week,
Yeah.
and then had to work to create Sunday and all that had to hold.
yeah, so.
So you can't just click like?
Sorry. Turns out it's not as important as we thought it was.
When I was asked to host this panel, moderate this panel this evening, we started doing meetings about what this was all about, this discussion. And the one word I kept using, I think the Tenement Museum and Annie and Kat all probably got tired of hearing me say, was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. That's what this topic is. That's what this discussion has been. And I want to thank our panel. Annie Polland. Annie Polland, Jelani Cobb, and Leslie M. Harris, and Anna Deavere Smith. And a big, big, big thank you to the Tenement Museum.
And a big, big, huge thank you to WNYC. And I hope
WNYC.
this is the first of many to come.
We have some talking to do.
Excellent, excellent.
The Green Space, especially Emily Botine, Alec Hamilton, Megan Ryan, Ryan Wild, Kat Lloyd, and of course, thank you to the audience tonight, all of you who came out tonight for your questions, your thoughtfulness, and your curiosity. Travel safely home. I'm Michael Hill.